Good evening. Welcome. Hi, my name is Omar Dawahede. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And on behalf of our Director, Jill Lane, our faculty and students, we want to welcome you to today's first screening of the Indocumentales series of this season. So welcome, thanks for being here, thanks for showing out. Just a quick word about CLACS, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. It's both a master's program and a Title VI funded National Resource Center. And what that means is that we get funding from the Department of Education in order to promote better understanding of our region of Latin America and the Caribbean. And we do that through public programming, like what we do, like what we're doing tonight. Less commonly taught languages being taught at our center, in our case is Quechua and Haitian Creole, and teacher training. And that's very relevant today because we have some of our teacher fellows in attendance. So welcome. And if you want to learn more about what we do, just look us up on the web. We're also on all social media portals. So if you're going to be tweeting tonight, look us up and use the hashtag Indocumentales 2019. We're also live streaming the discussions on this event. So if you can take a minute at some point and look us up on Facebook, we're clacs.nyu, and share it with your contacts so everyone gets to hear about this wonderful conversation. So now I'm going to leave the podium to Shamina de Gonzaga, who's going to be moderating the conversation today. And she's one of our partners from the War of the People's Council at the UN and What Moves You. So, Shamina de Gonzaga.
Good evening, everybody. As Omar mentioned, my name is Shamina de Gonzaga. I'm with What Moves You and World Council of Peoples for the United Nations. We were, I say this every time, but I think it's important because it's been 10 years now since we conceived of Indocumentales. And we never could have imagined that 10 years down the road the topic would remain so pertinent in the worst possible way, one could argue. So as Omar mentioned, I'll be facilitating the discussion after the film. We're delighted to have with us tonight Daniel Mendiola and some background music. Daniel is going to present the topic of the film, which my colleague Legality will introduce in a moment, in a context that maybe doesn't come up as often as it should. When we think about borders, we have maybe Trump's wall in our mind, but do we have the evolution of borders, the meanings attached to it, and how those have changed over time, present in our psyches? So Daniel's research is, I think, going to provide some enlightening discussion points for us to start looking at this perspective from different angles. And thank you for taking time out of what is, I'm sure, a very busy Monday mid-September in New York to join us. I'll see you after the screening, and I'd like to ask Pilar from Cinema Tropical to share a little bit about tonight's wonderful film. Pilar?
Thank you, Shamina. My name is Pilar Garrett. I'm the Assistant Director of Cinema Tropical. We are one of the co-presenting partners of Indocumentales. Thank you all again for being here, the first Indocumentales screening of the semester. I know there's another big event happening outside, but I'm glad everyone's here. I'll just say a little bit about the film. So this is the first New York screening of Pau Ortiz's The Other Side of the Wall. It's a Mexican-Spanish co-production. The film also won Best Documentary Film at Hot Docs, Full Frame, and Chicago International Film Festival. So we feel very grateful to be screening it here at NYU for the public, which is awesome. I'll also say that we will be having our second Indocumentales screening on October 21st of Andrea Cordoba's Sanctuary, which is fully shot right here in New York City and is a very, obviously, extremely immediate story. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.
As mentioned, we're very happy to have with us this evening Daniel Mendiola, who's faculty fellow here at NYU. Daniel hails art. Okay. Better? And this part of the discussion is being filmed. These are public archives, just FYI if anybody doesn't want to be on campus. So we're fortunate to be joined this evening by Daniel Mendiola, who's a faculty fellow here at NYU, hailing originally from East Texas, and whose research is focusing on borderlands, and this in a perspective over time in the New Spain. So you've looked at how borders, as we know them today, and the structures of nation states have inherited much from times of empires, and yet the definitions of borders have shifted. So could you share with us a little bit about just in general how you approach this issue, and what drew you to it?
Of course. Well, I think an interesting illustration to begin with. So one of the history courses that I used to teach when I was teaching at the University of Houston is we used to do this exercise. So I would start off the class and I would just put a hypothesis on the board and let the students try to decide to what extent that hypothesis was valid or not, to what extent they agreed with it. And so one week, when I knew we were going to talk about immigration, the hypothesis that I started with was very simply that the United States is a nation of strong borders. Let the students attack that. And so they had already been trained pretty well to sort of question this idea, the different terminology. So like, well, what is the United States? What is a nation state? What is a border? And they were picking apart all these terms and analyzing this. But what was interesting, and actually what I suspected was going to happen, is when they were trying to define what would be a strong border, pretty much the only way they were able to think about that was in terms of immigration. So they weren't 100% sure what a strong border was, but it always had something to do with people crossing the border. Okay, so they were completely mind blown when I told them that in the 19th century, nobody would have thought like that. In the 19th century, what constituted a strong border versus a weak border had absolutely nothing to do with immigration. People could cross the border all day, whenever they wanted, and it didn't really affect things. And so one of the things that I think is important for, and of course, me being a historian, and wanting to always take things a step further back into the context, is one of the things we need to remember about the borders is the way the borders are constructed today, and the way the borders are constructed and that are affecting the lives of people like you were just seeing in this film is a very recent phenomenon. It's not implicit in the definition of a border that it is possible to make someone's physical presence illegal, or that it's not implicit in the definition of the nation state that the border is going to be constructed in that way. Nation states were around for a very long time without borders. They could make people illegal, and so step one, I guess, whenever I try to have a conversation about the situation that we're in or why people are living the lives that they're living like we just saw, is we have to remember that this is new, and this is something that's constructed, and it's not inevitable, and it's not natural, and it's not timeless. I guess it's always a nice starting point, and so I've been researching that.
Well, and we were talking a little bit before the film about your own experience growing up in a town in East Texas where having Hispanic heritage didn't single you out in the crowd, and the change even in this country in terms of before and after 9/11 when it comes to how one's heritage suddenly plays into the dynamic of living here.
I think that's possible. And of course, this is a bit anecdotal to talk about the way 9/11 has affected things. But I think part of the evidence, like if we look in the very long term, borders simply couldn't make someone illegal until the 20th century. Right? Earlier, like maybe the 1920s is when we get the first major sort of like federal immigration legislation in the United States, and then that starts to spread to other countries as well. Which we're also going to have a conversation about after watching this film, countries like Mexico, for example. But I think another thing that's important is even, like I grew up in Texas, right? So I'm from a border state, and the meaning of the border in the 1990s was very different from the meaning of the border now. And you can see it in terms of the way the border is practiced, the way the border is enforced. In the 90s, you could just walk across the border for a day trip like it was nothing. Now you have to have a passport, there's all kinds of checkpoints, and it's a completely different world. So anecdotally, I think historians are going to come to this conclusion in hindsight later on, is that 9/11 was a major turning point. I think, and from my personal experiences, my presence was never questioned, I guess, as a kid in the 1990s. But after 9/11 is when this new discourse does seem to start, where now all of a sudden it becomes, I guess, more mainstream to question presence. It becomes more accepted to say, well, does this person belong here? Is this person a threat? And again, that's anecdotal, but I think it's something that we can definitely see in the way growing in a border state, I guess, meant something very different a few years ago than it means now. And so this is another great example of how these things are constructed in very particular times, and we can't make the mistake of thinking about them as timeless.
And as you were starting to mention, here in this country, we tend to think about borders of the U.S. logically, and of course, some of you might have seen a rally across the street. Immigration is a topic that's going to come up in every election, but it's certainly not limited to this country as a topic. Around the world, we're seeing similar polarizing effects. And again, as you just noted, this film is showing us what it means to be undocumented in Mexico. I'm wondering, when you were looking at your research and analyzing the New Spain and this kind of colonial heritage, could you share a little bit of light on that and how you see other countries in the Americas grappling with the question of migration?
Absolutely. I think what's very important to note, I guess, is this film could have been made in the United States, could have been in Mexico, it could have been in Costa Rica, it could have been in Panama. The idea that borders have the capacity to make someone illegal, and that is going to affect every aspect of their lives, how they make their living, how their livelihood. That is a global system, right? The fact that borders do that, the fact that borders act in that way is not just in the United States, but that is something that's global, and you can see in just about all of these countries. And so one of the important things, I guess, to think about the way borders function, or the way there is sort of this global discourse of the way a nation state is supposed to work, and there's this global discourse about the way borders are supposed to work. And so we can talk a lot about, in a lot of ways, sort of the United States has set the tone for these policies, and so the immigration policies in the 1920s were one of the first examples of these blanket immigration laws, where the default position is, if you cross the border, that is illegal, unless you have special permission, right? Which is the opposite of what it was before. Before it was, we reserve the right to kick you out, but you're probably legal. That was the 19th century. But in the 20th century, it flips and says the default position is, if you cross the border, you're illegal. And from that time on, slowly throughout the 20th century, this starts to spread to other countries as well. And the discourse is very surprising about how consistent it is, I guess. And so one of the things that I noticed, for example, when I was doing research in Costa Rica, it was a similar situation in the 19th century, where the border was completely open in the 19th century. And actually, in the 1850s, there was actually a law that explicitly said in Costa Rica, anyone who is able to work is allowed to come here. That was like the only restriction. If you're willing to work, then you have. They actually used the word right. It says you have the right to move to Costa Rica. By the 1870s, they were saying, unless you're Chinese, and then that's going to be the limitation. And that's around the same time in the United States, we start getting this discourse of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or the support for Chinese Exclusion Act start to build. And then famously, the first sort of federal immigration law is going to be the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it was, I guess, illuminating to me to see how these discourses about what counts as the people that we want in our country versus the people who are going to be undesirables, and how we need to make legislation around that, was a global phenomenon happening at the same time all throughout the Americas. And so the influence of Asian migration on immigration policy, that's not just a part of US history, that's part of the history all over the Americas. It goes in Central America, it's part of the history of Mexico, it's part of the history of Peru. Asian immigration completely changed the world in terms of immigration policy in the 19th century. In the 20th century, we're going to see Jewish refugees are also going to sort of be part of this, I guess, the efforts to exclude Jewish refugees during the 1930s and 1940s, and is also going to have a major effect on immigration law. And again, that's not just the United States, it's going to be in Europe, that's going to be all throughout the Americas, it's going to be in Cuba. And so I could go on with examples, but the point is that it's surprising how consistent these discourses are, I guess. It's very, very rare that they're isolated, but these are pretty much always global discourses that are, when people are talking about how do we exclude people and what are the practices we're going to use to exclude people from our country, it's across the board. There's a lot of interaction.
And speaking of exclusion, one strategy for that is to reduce people to these kind of labels and groups by either nationality or religion or ethnicity, whatever the case might be. I find it interesting in this film, we don't know exactly what is the story that led to this, the head of household, the mom, being in prison. Although it seems like the charges are questionable, and it's implied that being undocumented made her more vulnerable to being found guilty by, including testimonies from people who she didn't even know. So taking that and then moving to one of the narratives that we've heard in recent years here about criminals coming into the country. Well, what constitutes a criminal? You touched on the point of just being undocumented can itself criminalize somebody, but then there's also the vulnerability to being entrapped somehow by a criminal justice system in any country if you don't have the necessary recourses or knowledge to navigate a complex system in a country that's not your own. With that, I'd like to take advantage of all of the wealth of knowledge and perspectives in this room to invite you. I can't see you very well for some reason, the light today is very bright. But to share any thoughts you have coming from the film, any questions or feedback to Daniel, anything else you'd like to introduce to the conversation. If you could just raise your hand. Anybody? Yes,
Where was the dad?
Well, there's it's not answered conclusively in the film, but when Rosillo is simulating, we feel that he's in New York. I don't know, Pilar, if you have any information about the father's whereabouts.
From the filmmaker's side, we haven't heard anything specifically.
Yes, thank you. Yes, in the back.
No, I think I can hear and need to stand up. One of the problems with debating issues like this is definition of terms. And you talked about making people illegal. We're not making people illegal, it's just that if someone was to enter someone's domicile, for example, you have homes, if someone enters your apartment or your house, wherever it is you live, and you didn't welcome them in, you would have legal recourse. And the extension of a person's home, the extension of a person's community, is a nation. It's a community of people who willingly submit to a group of rules, okay? And so if other people come into that area, you welcome them in according to your rules. If they choose not to observe those rules, or if you have persons in that home or that domicile who want to facilitate that, then we're talking about different issues rather than the mere humanitarian issues. Nobody here is blind or cold towards the neediness of people. But we also must agree that, or at least observe, that people's self-interest is usually tied into a greater community. And the idea that we have to create laws where people should go willy-nilly. And if you're talking about the 19th century, this is also kind of a false precedent. The America's history is very different now than what it is then. We had braceros, and there's the bracero program lasted well into the 20th century. And that was almost like a reconstitution of slavery, in a sense. They wanted labor that was undercompensated or uncompensated. So if you have a system of laws, whether it's a person's home or a greater nation, you have to institute some program that sets some ground rules that everyone can agree to. So I think that's really the issue here to be addressed. Just a comment, and you can reply or react to it any way you choose.
All comments are welcome in this space, and thank you for sharing your observations. On that point, in the 10 years we've done this program in many different spaces, there have been times where people from communities that had an easy time getting into this country, let's say because for political reasons, the US might have allowed, made it quite easy so that one could arrive here without being considered illegal per se, and another person coming from another country that didn't have that same political arrangement would not be subject or would not have that same ease. So this question that you're raising about legality is certainly critical. At the same time, there are valid questions I would think, and I'm interested in hearing from others about the arbitrariness at times of laws. How are they applied? How are they designed? With what purpose in mind? I thought Daniel's reminding us of certain acts of exclusion and how different groups of people have been subjected to restrictions at different times in history is interesting, because by today's standards, some of what was legal in the past might no longer be considered moral or acceptable. So at what point do we cease questioning our laws and the way in which they're implemented? Just a thought, not a rebuke or a reply per se, but just a thought to continue the conversation. Daniel or anyone else on that or any other topic?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one thing is, as a historian, I would say that even in the 19th century, we were a nation of laws, even in a time where people were allowed to cross the border without checking them. Nobody in their minds thought that was a violation of sovereignty, because it's just not how the border was defined. Or nobody thought that was a violation or that was creating any type of threat, because they just didn't think about the border in that way. So if a private individual wanted to cross the border without asking permission, they could just decide on their own. But we were a nation of laws, and the law said that was okay. Now what has changed is now, of course, we're still a nation of laws, that's the same, but we've changed what those laws are, and we've changed the way the border affects things. And so we decided before that if someone enters your private domicile, of course, that is illegal, but if they want to cross the border because they want to get a job or whatever in public space, and we used to say that was fine. But what has changed is now that act is making the capacity for the border to criminalize someone's physical presence, to say your physical presence on this side of the border is that in and of itself is an illegal act, is a recent thing. I think is the bottom line. And so the morality of that, or to what extent that system is necessary, is clearly up for debate. But what is a fact is that is very recent. And I don't think that before we had that system, the borders were weak. Borders were just as strong. We just had a very different definition of what made a border strong or not. It was mostly defined in terms of sovereignty. This is U.S. and this is where U.S. laws are enforced. This is Mexico, and this is where Mexico laws are enforced. And if people want to decide which side of the border they want to live on, that was totally up to them, and nobody felt threatened by that until fairly recently. And so I think that part of that fundamental change in the way we think about borders and practice them is different. And then what we should be doing now is debating to what extent that change has been for the better, or maybe if we should, in a sense, I might be a little conservative in this way, that I think we should go back to the way things were before. That's the debate we should be having.
I'm sorry, there is one lady behind.
Good evening. I just moved here to New York from El Paso, Texas. I've been here a month, and so my 50 years here on this earth, I have lived in a border town community, and I have seen the evolution of, as you say, definitions of how borders are defined or how we relate to them. I mean, I went from my childhood living probably 3 miles from the border, the Mexican border, and there were no fences. It was just the river, and there was only a small portion of it that was canalized, I guess is the term, for the Chamizal Treaty, just to set clear lines to define the border, correct? But for the most part, it was just the river, the Rio Grande, and people would go and sit there on the levee of the river and just enjoy it, and it was nice. And crossing the border both ways, it was very friendly, very open, a lot of sharing of communities and cultures. It was positive. As I got older, things started to change, but you're right, around 9/11, I remember going to a wedding in Juarez, Mexico, a week after 9/11. And what used to take me 20 minutes to cross back took me probably 6 hours. I got home at 6 in the morning. And all of a sudden just this fear coming into the community. But I remember the community there being kind of like fighting it off because people were their lives were so intertwined. People had family on both sides. And it was just an everyday thing of going to work on both sides, going to school on both sides, going shopping on both sides, and people feeling okay about it, and it still feels that way. But I see that what's changed is other people from further down, Central America, I guess, trying to come up, and I feel that it's out of desperation and not a criminal element that drives them up north. Not saying, hey, I want to step into your backyard and commit crimes. I think people just want to have a better life for their families, like this family in this movie. And I saw the desperation firsthand because I still go to Mexico. I just went there right before I came here and went shopping, and you still see people there, waiting around for their chance to get knocked on, their doors knocked on and saying, hey, you have your appointment now, you can come over. But physically crossing the border, they've got barbed wire now at the top of the bridge. They have immigration officers in riot gear, and it's like it was never like that. And it's just horrible that it's become this way. And it's true, it's this change in definitions about, well, this is mine and I don't want you taking it. Where it was never like that, it was always sharing. And also seeing, people going to Mexico and they have their laws, and I would see a lot of American citizens disrespecting those laws and feeling very entitled, like, I don't care if it's your backyard, I don't care if it's your home, I'm an American and I can do what I want. So it goes both ways. I just wanted to share that point of view.
Thank you so much. Do you mind, we'll take a few comments first. I think the lady, if you could pass it down, and then the front. Thank you.
So I think it's also very important to, we only see immigrants when they're crossing. You're illegal, why did you came here? It's not fun to cross the border. It's not fun to leave your house, your family, your friends. I think the U.S. in specific, it's responsible for a lot of the humanitarian crises that have happened in Central America. I'm the perfect example. I'm from Nicaragua, and that keeps happening. In Honduras, there was a coup in 2008, I believe. 2002. No, 2008.
I believe.
Yes,
Nine. But anyway, the consequences of that is this. So I think we can't ignore that part.
Thank you. We'll take I think, Madam, you had something you wanted to say before?
I'm just like a
Just-
little scattered, but I feel that United States had a hand in doing the countries in Central America and
It's for the,
no, and causing the problems that we're having. And also like the society's getting away from the United States, the blue eyes, and people are seeing that we're becoming café con leche. And so there is like a, what's going on kind of thing. When I came as a 17-year-old with my mother from Argentina, and I feel like in a month or two we had our green card. But I was in San Francisco, and there was this thing that anybody, no matter what country you came from, you were Mexican. And if you were Mexican, you were down. You know, it wasn't a good thing to be. And so, you know, that affected me, like I just didn't want to be Latina. And life went on like that until I was about 30 and realized, hello, you know, what are you doing? So I think the United States had a lot to do with what's going on now. And it's like, I don't know what they're reacting. They should be helpful because of all retribution, all the stuff that they did.
Thank you. I think it's often come up that there isn't so much knowledge in the broad public in the U.S. about the U.S.'s involvement in the developments in the rest of the Americas. So thank you both for raising that. There were two other hands, the gentleman, I think in the third row. Did you? Oh, sorry, I thought he was, but.
That's okay.
Well, hello.
I'm sorry, thank you. I can't see very well. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, based off of some of the comments, have 2 points to make. Just this idea about how important history is and how what has happened to these countries in the past is influencing migration today. For example, I was born here, but my parents came from the Dominican Republic, and I wasn't really connected with my heritage growing up until I entered university and minored in Latin American Caribbean Studies, and I had this project where I had to interview an immigrant, and I was like, well, that'll be simple. I'll just have a conversation with my mother. And there's these list of questions that I'm asking her, and one of the last ones was, well, like, would you have, like, did you want to come here? And then she kind of looked at me like if I was crazy. She was like, who would want to like leave their country, the place that they were born in, to come to a place where they can't speak the language and they don't know anybody? And it was like, and she explained that she did it out of necessity. And then I started to like study the history of the Dominican Republic, and I was like, oh wow, the United States did all of these things in that country, destabilized it, and then she felt like she had to come here. And then I've had the opportunity to visit various countries in Latin America, and it's the same story all the time for the family member that decided to leave. And it wasn't out of a desire to leave, but it was more out of necessity. So I feel like that's always important when we're thinking about these things, like what influences that, and like to go into the past. But also a second comment that I had is actually that I've been living in Mexico. I live in Mexico now, just visiting right now, and I've traveled to Chiapas a month ago, where I believe this film takes place, and it was very interesting. I went from Oaxaca to Chiapas. It was fine. I got on a bus, 11 hours. I was in Tuxtla, the capital. Then I went an hour more south to San Cristobal. It was fine. Nobody did anything to me. And then once I tried to return from San Cristobal back north, like things just got weird. I was traveling without my passport because in the United States I don't travel with my passport, and I just like I'm this American who thinks like, oh, like everything's chill. And then I start coming back up, and on the first ride back from San Cristobal to Tuxtla, they stop the bus, and they look at everyone and they just stare at me, the federal police, and they're like, where are you from? Where are you going? Where is your documents? And I was just like, I'm from the United States, but I'm talking in Spanish. Maybe I should have just spoken in English. But yeah, all I have is my driver's license. They're like, why are you traveling without a passport? And they were like really questioning me, like if I was, like what was I doing there and if I was a United States citizen. And I saw a lot of Honduran people in San Cristobal. And even when I was looking at this film, I couldn't really tell where they were from until they said it. I was like, are they Dominican? So I was like I got lucky. The guy was like, look, I'm gonna let you go, but I can't tell you what's gonna happen to you beyond this point, because I'm traveling without a passport. And then on the bus ride from Tuxtla up to Oaxaca, it happened twice again. 2 times the bus got stopped. Both times I was the only person questioned. This was a much bigger bus with like 50, 60, 70 people on it now. And like there was some white travelers next to me, and no one got woken up, no one got asked anything except me. I got grilled really hard, like what are you doing, like where are you coming from, where are your papers? And I just wanted to say that. I wanted to say that because it's like this extension of the border. Now I hear a lot of stories about like you're approaching the border, you're 100 miles away from the border, and all of a sudden like you're getting asked like where are your papers? But it's kind of like, if I'm within the country, like why are you asking me for these kind of documentation?
Thank you so much for sharing, and we'll take this comment from the gentleman in the front here, and then I'd like to revert back to Daniel, who was talking, also has something to share on remote control borders. Is that the
Hello. Hopefully a quick comment. I mean, at this point it sounds cliche and redundant to say that not only are the U.S. or is the U.S. a country of immigrants, the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, essentially, all of the Americas, we are all immigrants unless we are of indigenous origin. So having said that first, I think fundamentally the issue that we face, or many of us face here in the States, in the United States, is that me personally, for example, all of my formal education has been in the States. And in saying that, it's regrettable that we have never been taught. Textbook education in America never teaches the history of America and what America has been. I mean, for example, to your point, the issues of immigration and what it was like in the, pre-20th century, where borders were open, or the concept of making others, as such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example. I mean, this is fundamentally how America has been built. So I think it does no service to any of us to forget this, and in fact, it's always worth reminding everyone of what America has always been. So I think it's not an issue of following laws, because laws are arbitrary, and especially it's always arbitrary which laws are followed and how they're put into effect and practiced. So, so the argument about following laws, well, the Third Reich was law, and that government established those laws. Does that make it right? I mean, I think everyone would agree that no, that was not the right law per se to follow. So that argument to me is so arbitrary, it makes absolutely no sense. And it's not a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue, because it's essentially we all should be treated with respect and dignity, because we are all human beings.
Danny, would you like to share some thoughts either on what has been said, or also I think you had told me that you were studying this issue of the expansion of the border, as the gentleman was mentioning his own experience.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's a good transition, I think, in both of these senses. Because the point that you're making about the extension of the border is a very, very important one. It's almost just the fact that the border exists means it has its effects. It doesn't necessarily matter where the border is. The border is going to affect you, because we live in a bordered world. And one of the things that's come into the news more recently, I guess, though it's been going on for a lot longer, is this idea of remote controls of the border. And so if the government, we've constructed the border in the way where we don't want people crossing except for this very small percentage of people who have special permission, which is essentially a lottery system. The vast majority of people simply are not allowed to cross. And so what the government wants to do is to try to stop them from getting there well in advance. And so what this boils down to is, so to some extent, the experiences that you were experiencing in Mexico are a result of U.S. pressure, right? So the U.S. government, and this is very well documented, the U.S. government puts pressure on other governments to try to intercept migrants just in case they're trying to come to the United States, or if they seem to have the intent. And so this is definitely the case in Mexico. This is definitely the case you've seen in the news recently with Guatemala, with this sort of like third country solution. Okay, but at the same time, we also want to avoid this sort of deterministic, the United States is all powerful and everything is the United States' fault sort of narrative, because one, that just gives simply too much power to the United States. But it also ignores sort of like the grassroots effects. I mean, there is sort of this discourse in Mexico where they're afraid of Central Americans, right? And they think that Central Americans are taking their jobs, or they think that they're criminals. I mean, this is a discourse that's at the grassroots level, the same way as the United States, right? We can't just blame everything on top-down systems or attribute everything, all these powers to top-down systems in the United States. A lot of this grassroots fear, right? And so a lot of what you experienced is coming from just regular people being afraid and thinking that Central Americans coming to Mexico are dangerous, or Guatemalans thinking that Salvadorians are dangerous, or people in Panama thinking that Venezuelans are dangerous. A lot of this is taking, so it's a combination of the top-down sort of pressures to extend the border with these remote controls that is definitely documented, it's definitely happening. But there's also a grassroots element in all of these countries as well, which is complicated. I'm not going to have the last word on or why it's happening. This is really the story of the 20th century, is the story of the nation-state nationalism, and go read some books about it because there's lots of them. It's a complicated topic. But that's essentially a huge part of this. Now, getting to the point too that you were making about the inconsistency in laws is another really important one when we're talking about these remote controls. Because essentially what has happened is over the last, basically in mostly in the post-World War II era, but to some extent before, like I mentioned with Jewish refugees, is one of the way that the international asylum regime or the international refugee system works is essentially that it is legal to ask a country for asylum, right? And there's all these international agreements that say that countries have to do that. To be a good country, you have to honor this sort of like asylum system. But the way the system works is someone is not allowed to ask for asylum unless they're in these very specific spaces, right? So you have to be able to reach a certain place to be able to exercise this right, or to be able to ask for this right. So what governments do is essentially, and I was reading a really good book about this that worded it really well, where basically what this book was calling the global north, what they say is, if you get here, you will have the right to have asylum, but we're going to stop you from getting here. And so essentially, a lot of these controls are essentially this idea is that if it is legal for someone to ask for asylum, then there's all these different sort of systems that the government will do to try to prevent people from being able to reach that space where they can ask for asylum. And so I think it's important because now it's starting to get more into the news, I guess, where with the sort of like the migrant protection protocols, the stay in Mexico policy, which is essentially, and then so while people, for example, so if they come from Central America, and then if they do make it all the way through Mexico and get to the border and they try to do an asylum claim, there's all kinds of ways to make that really difficult. So for example, they'll only look at process a few per day while there's thousands of people waiting, and they're assuming that eventually they're just going to give up and go home. It's kind of the idea. Process this as slow as possible. Sometimes if you only get one chance, so if you want to make an asylum claim, you get this court date, and so you have to wait in Mexico, and then you have to cross the border to go to your court date. The border people on the day of your claim will just stop you from crossing. They say, oh, well, there's you don't pass the health inspection or something like that. You missed your court date and your asylum. There's a really good article about this in the written by a team of lawyers in the USA Today, I think, a good op-ed a couple weeks ago of lawyers who went and were talking about this system. But the important thing, lest we blame the United States for everything, I mean, this is a system that the European Union has very similar systems that they're using. I mean, there's lots of, Australia has offshore detention centers, Canada has a lot of these systems in place. I mean, the idea is that these remote controls that prevent people from being able to ask for asylum in the first place, or to prevent refugees from getting in a position where they can ask for help. This is a global system that's been put into place, and I was, again, very strong evidence that the origins of the system were stopping Jewish refugees, is where a lot of these sort of like controls and these practices were first put into place. And then after that, after World War II, they've sort of like been a bit more systematized and put into place. But I think this is definitely a conversation that we need to be having, talking about, I guess, the paradox of asylum, right? So someone has the right to ask for asylum legally, but the only way to exercise that right is to cross the border illegally, or to, and the international asylum regime is essentially designed that way. And so these are conversations that we need to be having about, is that the system that we want to have? Because if we don't, we can change it. None of these things are timeless or are written in stone. They can be changed.
And Daniel, on that note, empowering commentary, I'd like to invite everyone to continue the conversations, be over some cheese or refreshment outside. Could we have a round of applause for Daniel? All of you for sharing your stories and your personal reflections. Thank you so very much to also NYU for hosting us. And we will hope to see you again on the 21st of October. We'll be showing a film called Sanctuary, which again will deal with many of these questions. Legality, morality, are they necessarily the same thing? How do we grapple with them going forward, including right here in New York? We'll also have an event at the United Nations on the 18th of October, that's open to the public and very youth-oriented. So you'll be getting more information about those events pretty soon. Thank you. Have a nice evening.